I'm Allen Smutylo. I'm an artist and a writer. I'm going to give you a little bit different perspective than Mark's presentation. Being a professional artist and writer, it's an odd profession to get to say what you want about whatever you want. It sounds good, except when you realize that nobody really cares what you say. This was illustrated to me many years ago when I was giving my son advice on getting his first summer job. And I told him about, a good resume and dressing properly for the interview, follow up with a telephone call. After I finished, he cocked his head, looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, you've never had a job." Well, what I'm going to do, being an artist, you never want to miss an opportunity to flog your own work. So I'm going to illustrate this with my paintings, and I'm basing this talk on a chapter in the book I've just published called The Memory of Water. Whoa, that's big. That's a 6 by 9 inch watercolor. So pretty damn good, I'd say. So I work in watercolor, and I work on site when I go on a trip. These small 9 by 12 or 6 by 9 watercolors. I use those watercolors, photographs, and other research material, some archival photographs at times. When I come back from a trip, I develop this work in my studio, and then I show it somewhere at a gallery and then continue on with another trip, so on and so forth. So I work in watercolor. I work in larger watercolor. This would be a studio piece. And I work in etching. These 4 pieces up here tonight are etching. This is a process of, it's a limited edition print, not to be confused with limited edition reproductions. So this is a very old technique that's, well, I won't go into it. Anyway, these are etchings in editions of about 50 or so. And I also work oil on canvas, but I'm not going to talk too much about technique or art-related stuff tonight, but I'm just going to show you kind of how I respond to certain things. So I spent about the first about 12 years, 13 years of my career as an artist, as a young artist in Ontario. After that, I started to travel, and I started to travel increasingly to the Arctic. In the middle part of my career, probably a 15-year period, I was traveling exclusively to the Arctic, to Alaska and as far east as East Greenland, and up to North Ellesmere Island and Labrador. And it sounds like I've covered everything, but not at all. I've just covered very specific little spots, going to different spots each time. And then when I get back, whatever happened on those trips, whatever little adventure, whatever encountered, I try to illuminate that in my artwork and sometimes in my writing. So when I first went to the Arctic, I was sort of pretty impressed with this new visual vocabulary. I was seeing a land without trees. I was seeing a land that in the summer just exploded with summer wildflowers. And I saw on the water these huge cathedrals of ice, like time capsules. On the land, there'd be glaciers. And this very specific Arctic light that people talk about, this low angle without much absorption. This one here is Ellesmere Island. You can see the ones, well, it doesn't really matter, but I sign the ones I do on location at the top and just date them that way. And then I started to see, of course, coming across wildlife, sometimes birds in the thousands or tens of thousands, and other times just a solo bird like this snow owl. We've already talked about these guys, these looking very prehistoric. These muskox, I had some run-ins with these guys. They're normally not very dangerous, but they can be, I found out. And the walrus, 2,000 pounds. These are actually, the rogue walruses are actually extremely dangerous. They can and have killed kayakers. I've been attacked by these guys. And of course, the icon of the Arctic, I was attacked by this guy too. So I stopped going to the Arctic after this guy. This is, I think, the first oil painting I'm showing here. After a few years of, getting excited about all the different things I got excited about, I started to think about the people that live there, the indigenous people and the people that came before the pre-Inuit. And I spent probably about the next maybe 8 years developing a lot of work around that. Generally speaking, the Arctic is, in terms of habitation, the Arctic has seen 3 main groups come in. There's been lots of subgroups, but it has about a 4,000-year-old history of habitation. The first people were called independents. These were essentially land hunters that arrived in very small groups, scattered groups, family groups. And they came into the Arctic when the Arctic was probably as warm, maybe a little warmer than it is today. When the temperature got cold, this culture was replaced by the Dorset culture, which adapted to colder temperatures, were very successful flow edge and ice edge hunters, harpooners. 1,000 years ago, the temperature warmed, and a new people came into the Arctic from Siberia, and these were the Thule. And the Thule culture quickly overran. They had better technologies. They quickly overran the Dorsets relatively quickly. It took probably a couple hundred years, if longer. And they replaced the Dorset people all across the Arctic. And the Thule people are, that culture is morphed into or transitioned into the Inuit that live in the Arctic today. I'm going to use, in terms of my, the words I use, I'm going to use Thule and I'm going to sometimes use Inuit. And that transition, it depends where it happened in the Arctic. It sort of somewhere happened around the 16th, 17th century that this transition happened, but it depends where exactly in the Arctic. But I don't think it really matters. But anyway, I'm going to use those two terms, so it might sound a bit confusing. I'm going to read some of this stuff. It's not that my writing's so good, but it is better than my ad-libbing. So if you don't mind, I'm going to do a bit of reading here if I can. So the Thule were distinguished by being great sea hunters, and they introduced the kayak to North America. And I thought, the kayak was such an amazing creation. High-functioning, technologically advanced, radically minimalist, remarkably individualized. The boat not only had an exquisite aesthetic, it was a remarkable bridge between a harsh environment and a hunting culture, between animal and man, between land and water, between the spiritual and the utilitarian, and between perishing and surviving. So for a number of years, I put kayaks in every piece of art I could think of doing. And so it's within that background that in 1991, I was in my studio. It was wintertime, it was Friday, and in the morning, I used to listen to the CBC radio and Peter Zofsky's Morningside. And that morning, he was talking to an ethnologist, talking about previous cultures in isolated places, and he was talking about the Thule culture. And I was listening, and I was actually, doing a painting probably of a kayak or something like this, and I was listening to this come across in my studio. And the guest said, maybe I should just read what I've written here. So the guest talked about the extraordinary clever list of tools and devices. Chief among them was the sea kayak. The listening audience was reminded that the boat was all the more impressive, fashioned out of a frozen land where nothing grows much above one's knee, and seaworthy enough to paddle the dangerous and unpredictable Arctic Ocean. He added their mastery in successfully hunting huge sea mammals, including the 70-ton bowhead whale, was considered by many anthropologists to be the apex of human endeavor. Full stop. He didn't say among polar people or hunter-gatherers. The apex of human endeavor. Well, in my romantic artistic mind, I had thought that, but I didn't say it out loud, and I hadn't heard anybody else say that. And it pushed me really to dive deeper into this idea of the kayak and the hunter. And it also gave me a new answer to the dinner party question, so what are you working on? Now I could tell them I'm documenting the apex of human endeavor. So there's two places that I thought might have evidence of the sea hunting culture. One was Thule, which is up here in North Greenland. The other one is right in here in Amasilik Island. And there's about 5 communities here. Now, these guys here were so isolated that nobody knew they were there until the early part of the 20th century. They were so far off the beaten path. These people are still hunters and fishers, but of course they've been overlaid with Western culture and consumer products and so forth. So it was in the summer of 1991 that I went to kayak around Amasilik Island. I went with Black Feather, and it was an exploratory trip for Black Feather. It was led by their director, Wendy Grader. I think there was 8 of us on that trip. It was just a 2-week trip. We landed in a little town called Kulisuk. And it's, we had to get there, they weren't flying across the ice cap at that time, so we had to get there from Iceland. And Iceland Tourism had decided that they could fill little planes full of tourists who wanted to see an authentic Inuit or community, so they were flying tourists in to see that. So we got a ride on a plane to Kulisuk and started our circumnavigation going counterclockwise around this island. It was only about 150 kilometers. Wasn't for 2 weeks. It wasn't hard going, and most of it, except from the ocean route, most of it was inland and quite safe to paddle. So when paddling along this route, my mind was full of thoughts about how could people exist here, because nothing was growing above one's knee, and there's only 9 terrestrial land mammals on Greenland, and there wasn't any evidence of them. In some places we camped, we came across the remains of Inuit, pre-Inuit Thule dwellings, sod huts, some driftwood, some whale rib bones, that sort of thing, and some graves, which would be cairns, rock cairns with flat rocks on top and skeletal remains and some artifacts inside. These were their permanent homes, their temporary winter dwellings that they would build probably on the ice, these snow houses or igloos. And one could imagine at night, we've seen photographs of that where a single candle inside an igloo and it would glow like an Arctic diamond. And just like the kayak, it was just this beautiful aesthetic combined with, just a modesty of materials and leaving a very, very light footprint. Now, when the early explorers first met the Inuit, it's quite interesting because they had conflicting views from what their preconceived notions of these people were and what they actually saw at times. It's interesting, a quote here from British Royal Navy Captain John Ross in 1830, when he wrote in his journal, "It was for philosophers to interest themselves in speculating on a horde so small and so secluded, occupying so apparently hopeless a country, so barren, so wild, and so repulsive, and yet enjoying the most perfect vigor, the most well-fed health, and all else that here constitutes not mere wealth, but opulence of luxury, since they were furnished with provisions as with every other thing that could be necessary to their wants." One of the things that really impressed all the explorers that went there in the 18th, 19th century were the fur and hide clothing of these people. And this essentially was under a woman's job description. And she would have an encyclopedic knowledge of the hides and furs and the strengths and weaknesses of all the materials. And she had to have that to keep her family alive in that kind of environment. I'm just gonna take a drink here. But a healthy culture that was just described, this could not be obtained, this kind of opulence that Ross talked about. You couldn't get this off the land. And the Tulis knew this, and they looked to the sea. And although the sea was cold and strewn with ice, salty, rough, oxygen deprived, it's loaded with life. And one huge whale, a big bowhead whale, would provide literally tons of food for themselves and their dogs, and provide all kinds of blubber that could easily be turned into oil to light their lamps and to cook and to keep them partially warm. So to accomplish this, the Thule built two kinds of boats. The Umiak, which was a 10-meter double-ended boat. It was a transport boat, both in the West and the Eastern Arctic. In the Western Arctic, they also used it for hunting. And of course, the kayak, designed to be silent and fast for hunting. And the boat's shape varied from community to community, depended on what kind of sea mammals they were hunting, on ice conditions, on wind conditions. Regardless, though, the kayak was always built like a tailored suit to fit the hunter. Functionally and materially, the boat was an extraordinary accomplishment. But wrapped in the kayak's conception and construction were the Thule's strong animistic beliefs that underlined their connection to the animal and spirit world. In The Memory of Water, I describe it this way. The craft structure had an organic symmetry to it, analogous to that of its maker. Skeletal rib frame of driftwood and bone, notched and socketed together like body joints, tied with sinew like ligaments and tendons, making it solid yet flexible, and then covered with a layer of skin from walrus and seals, sealed with blood glue. The spirit of the animal world, indeed. But the human now became the inner being, the new presence in the reconstructed entity. Together, the skin-wrapped skeleton and the hunter became one, half man, half beast, half alive, half dead, part of the terrestrial world, but animated only on water. With its new master, it became the hunter, returning to the ocean to betray its brethren. So let's see if I can see this right. Kulisuk, I think, is down here on this island. This is Amasilik. So we went inland here and then up here. Tinaquilakak. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I'm just trying to say that. Tinaquilakak. This is the town, the most isolated town that we'd be visiting, and this is where I'd hope to see evidence of this hunting culture, kayak hunting culture. So as we landed there, the first thing I noticed were dogs, hundreds of them everywhere. These were the famous Greenland dogs, considered by most people to be the purest of breeds in the world. Explorers used to come to Greenland, to West Greenland, before going to the Arctic or the Antarctic to purchase Greenland dogs. In the Amasilik area, only recently had people been relocated off the land. Previous to that, they lived in small family groups with all their dogs running free. Although they now lived in a village, they still let all their dogs run free. So there was dogs everywhere. And compounding that problem were the viciousness of these dogs. An anthropologist named Kurt Nutter from Denmark, he was in this town in the 1970s. And he talks of 1,200 dogs in a town of 100 people. And all the dogs were running free. Nutter states that after numerous maulings of people, mostly children, Denmark, which is a protectorate of Greenland, passed a law saying that all dogs had to be tied up. Nutter states that, of course, this proclamation coming from Denmark meant nothing and was totally ignored. After some more maulings, authorities were sent from Denmark, and in a 2-day period, they shot 122 dogs. And all the owners then tied up their dogs in this town, and they did that until the authorities left. And then all the dogs, as Nutter states, were running free again. More disturbing for me than the snarling dogs and a ground cover in canine feces was the garbage. The town was literally, it was like walking through a garbage dump. Garbage spilled out from the windows, around the doorways, so bad in the noonday sun, you had to cover your mouth and nose to walk through certain parts of the town. It was so bad. Every conceivable bit of consumer refuge that you could think of was just piled out. There was no attempt to put it in one spot, no attempt to organize it in any way. And Nutter says exactly the same thing existed 20 years. I was there 20 years after he was there. And he said that exactly the same conditions existed then. I forgot to click this thing here. So historically, East Greenlanders had no such thing as garbage. Food scraps, old hides, furs, guts, bones, worn-out clothing, old equipment would have been subject to recycling, being eaten by dogs, or organic decay. So it was apparent that the town was a town in name only. In reality, it was still a random collection of individual hunters and their families, pressured by modernity to live together. They might be dwelling in a village, but they functioned within the distant order and specific needs of the hunter-gatherer. I mentioned the dogs and the garbage because that was just a surface view of a far more troubling problem. In the hearts and minds of many of these people, life had lost meaning and purpose. The 5 settlements in the Amasilik district have a suicide rate 2 or 3 times that of the rest of Greenland. This statistic is even more shocking given that Greenland already has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. This is how I summed it up in this latest book. All Inuit have been having to adjust to vast cultural changes, but nowhere in the Arctic have these shifts been happening so quickly as in East Greenland. The people there are struggling through a seismic transition from what was effectively a nomadic sea hunting culture to a postmodern world. And this transition is only 2 or 3 generations old there. They've been asked to leave behind a 1,000-year-old tradition and grab on to a fast-paced world with radically different economies, technologies, social and spiritual values. It's as if they've been asked to hop a speeding passenger train. Following European contact, a vast array of social pathologies emerged. It started with a taste for the outside world's products. Then came the erosion and abandonment of traditional skills, which in turn led to a lack of work, an absence of self-worth. Depression, substance abuse, alcoholism followed. Spousal abuse, child neglect, violence, and suicide wasn't far behind. As I looped around the town, I came back down to the water. I came across this gorgeous skin-covered kayak 10 meters up from the water. This was not an artifact from a museum. It wasn't the result of a kayak building class. This boat hunted. It had a frighteningly narrow beam. Its cockpit was similarly minuscule. It was covered with sealskin, taut as a drum, patinaed in a beautiful gold, sienna, and umber colors. Where it was put together, sutured where the skin was sutured, it had been sealed with a blood glue that had gone black and blue. And the front and rear tie-downs on this kayak had little amulets of polar bear and seal and falcons carved in ivory. I write, it sat poised, elegant, and balanced, imbued with potential and purpose, like a samurai's sword. So you can see I had quite a conflict of stuff going on when I got there. I saw both this kind of powerful presence with this craft and the other side. The kayak was just one of a vast array of technologies the Thule invented. In fact, the Thule believed there wasn't a problem that a tool or device couldn't solve. Ethnologists credit them with having more gadgetry than any hunter-gatherer society in the world. And that's an amazing recognition given the scant resources of where they live. And even today, traveling with the Inuit, it's still apparent they have this amazing ability to problem-solve mechanical things. Having made the kayak and all its related technologies, then how do you train and prepare someone to go to the high-risk enterprise of hunting in a kayak, to go to the very edge of life as a way of life? Scandinavians such as Kuhn Rathmanson and Peter Freuen in the early 1900s, they married into Inuit society. They lived in Greenland. They knew the language. They were successful land hunters. Neither they nor any Scandinavian, even though they were in Greenland for 1,000 years on the west coast, was ever documented to be able to successfully hunt sea mammals in a kayak. In preparation for a livelihood of sea hunting, boys would start emulating their elders at a tender age. Fathers would build small little kayaks with outriggers like training wheels and put their little infant sons in them. Even on land, there would be a game where they'd put their youngsters in a pot and with a balancing stick, and a game to see how long they could stay upright. So, without these kids knowing, they were apprenticing for one of the most dangerous occupations that you could imagine. For men, hunting sea mammals weighing thousands of kilograms in the open ocean with a spear and a tippy kayak was indeed a high-wire act, at the edge of what was physically and mentally possible, and perhaps even beyond the edge. When anthropologists arrived on the East Greenland coast in the early 1900s, they documented a condition afflicting kayak hunters called kayak angst. And this affected about 15 to 20% of the hunters in East Greenland and West Greenland, but oddly it wasn't documented in the Canadian Arctic. It would happen in mirror-like conditions, very calm water, lots of reflections around them, and they would become dizzy, paralyzed with fear of capsizing, fear of drowning. They would become unable to paddle. They would need help to get back to shore. They might be able to go out again and hunt successfully, but if it happened to them once, they said it inevitably returned until, in a short period of time, they could no longer effectively hunt in a kayak. Circled this island and came out this fjord, this ice-choked fjord that you saw behind those hanging kayaks on that rack. And we're now at the open ocean. This is the last camp before we completed our little circumnavigation. I'm just going to read you what I wrote in my journal that night. After supper, I hiked to a rise of land and painted a scene of our route looking back into the fjord. As I worked, my thoughts drifted. How is it possible to survive here, to create a boat from what my eyes could see, made from washed-up driftwood and animal skins? How could such a craft be made seaworthy enough to paddle out into the open ocean and find, kill, and tow home a sea mammal perhaps 500 times your size, in an environment deemed one of the most unpredictable and inhospitable on Earth? I pushed to finish my little watercolor. The temperature of the late day air had plummeted and had begun to produce a skim of fine webbed ice crystals on my mixing tray, my paper, on my sable hair brushes. The air was damp, cold, and calm. Way off to the east, through a vaporous haze, enormous ice bulwarks paralleling the coast of Greenland in the current. To the south, a flat line of ocean curved out and under the planet, an uninterrupted continuum all the way to the ice chambers of Antarctica. Back to the west, the sea ice and icebergs remained backlogging the fjord we had left. Everywhere, my view is of a silent, brutal outpost, an unforgiving land, a most unlikely place to find signs of habitation, let alone evidence of the apex of human endeavor. When I returned home, I found an old anthropological account of a tiny village right across from where I was with the garbage, right across the Sermelik Fjord. This village has since been abandoned. And in the account, there was a small black and white photo of a stone kayak. And the stone kayak was in the play area of this village, and this was for young boys to play in this stone kayak. So when I came back, I built a clay model using the photograph as a reference, and built this clay model on a sheet of glass. And then I did an oil painting from that model. And in the painting, its form reflects onto the sheet of glass as if the stone kayak is floating on water, defying what is seemingly possible. For those of you who are in Toronto and might be interested, as it happens, I have an exhibition at the Miragadar Gallery at the moment. It'll be on for another 10 days. Miragadar Gallery is in Yorkville, in downtown Toronto, and it'll be on till the 23rd of February. It's called The Sacred and Profane, and it's work I did on the Ganges in India, in Varanasi. So, thank you very much, everybody.